In the early 16th century, the Mediterranean was not a calm blue shape on the map. It was the busiest highway of its time. Silver from the Americas, grain from North Africa, spices from the East, Ottoman troops, European pilgrims, all of them moved across this water. Any power that controlled these routes grew rich. Any power pushed away from them slowly suffocated. The story of Hayreddin Barbarossa begins inside this world. Today, he is often reduced to a single phrase: the man who made the Mediterranean a Turkish lake. There is some truth in that. But before he was a legend, he was simply one of three brothers, born on the island of Lesbos, in an Ottoman frontier family of sailors and small traders. Their names were Oruç, İlyas, and Huzur. As young men, they lived the life of typical Aegean mariners. With a modest ship, they sailed between Lesbos, Thessaloniki, and nearby islands, hauling olive oil, grain, timber, whatever the market demanded. At this stage, there was no great fleet, no imperial rank, and certainly no plan to terrify half of Europe. But in this century, the sea was never just a trade route. It was also an ambush. Knights of Rhodes, Italian privateers, and the armed galleys of rival powers blurred the line between commerce and war on an almost daily basis. On one of these voyages, Oruç and İlyas were attacked by the Knights of St. John, operating from their stronghold on Rhodes. In the brutal fight that followed, İlyas was killed. Oruç was badly wounded, then chained to an oar as a galley slave. For years he rode in the dark belly of other men's ships, the hardest school a sailor could ever be sent to. For the surviving brothers, this was the first major fracture. From that day on, the Mediterranean was no longer just a place to earn a living. It became the place where a debt had to be settled. Over time, the Barbarossa brothers did not just trade. They fought back. They began to attack the very corsairs and war galleys that had once hunted them. In Ottoman and Arabic sources, men like them are often called Reis, or sea ghazis, Muslim raiders who struck Christian shipping in the name of prophet and holy war at the same time. Italian and Spanish writers had a different word: Barbarossa, Redbeard. Originally, this nickname belonged to Oruç, whose beard was famously reddish. But in European imagination, it soon fused with his younger brother, Huzur, as well. For ordinary people living along the coasts, theory did not matter. If those red-bearded captains appeared on the horizon, it meant that something in their world was about to change. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. In some ports, especially where Spanish or Italian pressure was strongest, their arrival looked like salvation. Slave markets were raided, prisoners were freed. Muslim communities were evacuated from burning towns. In other places, especially where local rulers cooperated with Spain or refused to pay agreed tribute, the same sales meant danger. Warehouses might burn, and centuries of accumulated wealth could vanish in a single night. To understand Barbarossa properly, we need to see him not as a fairy tale pirate, but as a product of this hard, competitive Mediterranean. A world where trade and violence sailed side by side. By the late 1510s, the brothers had moved their base south and west into North Africa. From small island traders, they had become key players on the Algerian coast, fighting against Spanish expansion and local rulers who opened their ports to Iberian garrisons. Spain at this time was pushing aggressively into the Maghreb. They captured ports like Oran, built fortresses on small islands off Algiers, and tried to turn the North African coast into a chain of Christian strongpoints against both the Ottomans and local dynasties. The Barbarossa brothers, especially Oruç, became the sharp edge of resistance. In 1518, this struggle reached its breaking point near the inland city of Tlemcen. Oruç had briefly taken control there, hoping to build a stronger Muslim front. But Spanish forces and their local allies gathered in overwhelming numbers. After months of fighting, Oruç and his men were pushed back towards a fortress outside the city. Food was almost gone. Powder was running low. Many of the volunteers who had come south full of hope were now dead or wounded. The logical choice would have been clear to any commander. Cut losses, break out with a small escort, and try to save what remained of his power. Then came the news that changed everything. A group of Oruç's men, retreating along a riverbed, had been trapped on the far bank. Spanish troops lay in ambush between them and safety. On paper, the decision was simple: leave them. With those few dozen men, the war would not be won or lost. With their commander, it might still continue. But Oruç did something that military logic could not easily explain.
I won't leave my brave men there.
He refused to abandon them. With his brother Ishak and a small party of loyal fighters, he tried to break through to the trapped men. The details differ from source to source. Some describe a night assault in waist-deep water. Others, a desperate last stand near a river crossing. What they agree on is the outcome. Oruç and Ishak were killed in the attempt. In many history books, this appears as a brief line. Oruç Reis fell near Tlemcen. Behind that dry sentence stood a choice. The decision to share his men's fate instead of preserving himself at their expense. Far away in Algiers, when the news finally reached him, his ear now stood alone. His eldest brother, the original Barbarossa, was gone. So was Ishak. The man who would later be known as Hayreddin Pasha had just lost not only his family, but the commander whose shadow he had sailed under for years. From that day, Hizir was not just a skillful captain. He was the last surviving Barbarossa. After Tlemcen, the strategic picture in North Africa was brutally clear. Spanish power was growing. Their forts controlled key stretches of the coastline. Local dynasties were divided. Some resisted, some cooperated. Algiers itself was caught between these forces. Hizir understood something simple and uncomfortable. Alone, he would eventually share his brother's fate. His ships were fast, his men experienced, but against the resources of a united Spanish Habsburg monarchy and its allies, one independent corsair lord could not survive forever. At the same time, in the east, another empire was rising to maritime power. The Ottoman state had already taken Constantinople, pushed into the Balkans, and conquered Egypt. Under Selim I, Yavuz Sultan Selim, it now commanded huge manpower and resources. But it still lacked permanent, loyal bases in the far western Mediterranean. This was the gap Hizir decided to bridge. In 1519, he sent an embassy to the Ottoman court. they did not travel empty-handed. They brought Spanish prisoners, war trophies, and, most importantly, a formal request from the people of Algiers. They wished to place their city under Ottoman protection, to escape Spanish attack and unstable local rulers. The offer was as much political as it was personal. Algiers would become, in name, Ottoman territory. In return, the Ottomans would send troops, artillery, and money, and recognize Hayreddin as their governor and admiral in the region. For Istanbul, this was an attractive proposal. By accepting, Selim I could project Ottoman power hundreds of miles westward without building a base from scratch. He could harass Spanish routes, protect Muslim populations, and gain a foothold facing the western Mediterranean. The deal was struck. Hayreddin was appointed Belirbe, or governor of Algiers. Ottoman troops and guns were dispatched. Crucially, he also received permission to recruit volunteers in Anatolia and the Aegean. A stream of hardened seamen and soldiers who would soon fill the decks of his galleys. Around this time, another change occurred. The Sultan is said to have given Hayreddin a new honorific name, Hayreddin, the goodness of the faith. Combined with the European nickname Barbarossa, this is how he entered history, Barbaros Hayreddin. Under his rule, Algiers began to change. It was still a Corsair stronghold, but now it was also an Ottoman frontier province. The Friday sermon mentioned the Ottoman Sultan. Coins were struck in his name. The red-bearded captain was no longer simply fighting his own private war. He was part of a larger imperial system. For Spain and its Italian allies, this was a serious escalation. Raids and counter-raids along the coast were no longer just local quarrels. They were pieces of a much bigger contest between two empires for control of the Mediterranean. During the 1520s, Barbaros Hayreddin used Algiers as a launch pad. From there, he struck at Spanish positions, rescued Muslim refugees from Iberia, and harassed Christian shipping across the western Mediterranean. Each successful raid brought him more men, more ships, and more reputation. For ordinary people in port cities from Valencia to Tunis, his name now carried a double meaning. For some, it meant terror of sudden attack. For others, especially those facing Spanish persecution, it meant hope of rescue. Meanwhile, in the eastern Mediterranean, Ottoman-Habsburg rivalry was intensifying. Suleiman the Magnificent, Kanuni Sultan Suleiman, had become Sultan in 1520 and was leading campaigns deep into Europe. On land, Ottoman armies were feared. At sea, however, Spanish, Venetian, Genoese, and Papal fleets still believed they could contain Ottoman expansion. Istanbul now needed more than a distant ally in Algiers. It needed a supreme naval commander who understood the Western Sea as well as Ottoman generals understood the Danube and the plains of Hungary. In 1533, Barbaros Hayreddin was summoned to the imperial capital. He left trusted deputies in charge of Algiers and sailed east with a powerful squadron. Even on the way, he made his presence felt. Off Messina, he clashed with enemy ships and arrived in Istanbul with fresh trophies, a practical demonstration of what he could do. At Topkapi Palace, he was received with full ceremony. This meeting symbolized the union of two different but complementary experiences: the disciplined, land-based might of the Ottoman state and the flexible, brutal, first-hand knowledge of a man who had fought for decades on the open sea. The decision that followed changed the balance in the Mediterranean. Barbaros Hayreddin was appointed Kapudani Deria, Grand Admiral of the entire Ottoman fleet, and given the rank of Pasha. He was no longer merely the strongman of Algiers. He was now responsible for Ottoman naval power from the Aegean to the Western Mediterranean. Over the next years, he led campaigns against Venetian holdings in the Aegean, struck again at North African ports, and coordinated closely with Suleiman's land offensives. Step by step, the sea theater was being brought into the same strategic frame as the land wars. The climax came in 1538, in a gulf off the western coast of Greece, Preveza. There, a huge Christian coalition fleet assembled under the famous Genoese admiral Andrea Doria. Spanish, Venetian, Papal, Genoese, Maltese, and others together. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men. On paper, they vastly outnumbered the Ottomans. Opposite them stood Barbaros Hayreddin, with roughly 120 Ottoman galleys and galleots. The numbers looked hopeless, but sea battles are not decided by numbers alone. Barbaros chose his ground carefully, used the wind and coastline to limit the enemy's maneuver, and refused to be drawn into a fight on their terms. When the engagement finally came, his lighter, more unified galley force outflanked the heavier coalition ships. By the end of the day, the great Christian armada was in disarray. Dozens of their ships were sunk or captured. Ottoman losses were relatively light. Preveza did not give the Ottomans ownership of every wave and bay, but it sent a clear message. No single coalition could easily dislodge them from the eastern Mediterranean again. For decades afterwards, European writers would look back on 1538 as the moment when the Turkish sea order was sealed. And at the center of that memory stood the figure of Barbaros Hayreddin. Barbaros Hayreddin Pasha died in 1546. In his house overlooking the Bosphorus in Istanbul, he was buried at Beşiktaş in a tomb facing the water. Ottoman sailors had a custom. When the fleet left or entered the Bosphorus, its ships would salute his tomb with cannon shots, a ritual respect for the man who had carried their empire onto the open sea. His victory at Preveza and the system he helped build with the Ottomans did not freeze the Mediterranean forever. Over the following centuries, new powers, new routes, and new technologies shifted the center of gravity to the Atlantic and beyond. The Turkish lake slowly became one theater among many. But the deeper lesson of his career reaches beyond that specific time and place. Barbaros began as the son of a frontier family, trading modest cargo between minor ports. He was shaped by loss, by captivity, by the violence of the sea. He learned to use local grievances, imperial backing, and the geography of coasts and currents to turn scattered raids into a coherent system. In his age, the question was, who controls the routes across this water? Today, the routes look different. They run through shipping lanes and canals, through straits and energy pipelines, and through invisible cables and data networks on the ocean floor. Yet the underlying struggle is familiar. States still compete to secure choke points. Economies still depend on flows they cannot fully see. And behind every map of lines and arrows stand people making hard, often ruthless choices about how far they are willing to go to control those flows. When you look at Barbaros Hayreddin from this angle, he is not just a colorful pirate from a distant past. He is an early, sharp example of a pattern that keeps repeating. The use of mobility, information, and fear to lock and unlock the world's arteries. Centuries after his death, ships still pass his tomb on the Bosphorus. Most of the people on board probably do not think very much about him. But the questions he forces us to ask are still uncomfortably current. Who controls the routes? Who decides which city thrives and which one withers? Are you simply living at the edge of these currents? Or, in some corner of your own world, do you have a hand on the wheel? The names have changed, the sails have become engines, and the signals are carried by fiber optic light instead of lanterns. But the sea, in every sense, is still where power tests its reflection.